because it will end promptly at 2:30. I'm going to start, and I'm just going to introduce myself to all our attendees. My name is Scott Usborne. I'm the president of the Royal United Services Institute. Today we're doing a Zoom webinar with Dr. Harry Swain and Lieutenant General retired Kent Foster, all based on Harry's book, Oka, A Political Crisis and Its Legacy. I just finished reading it last night. It's very enjoyable. It's a light style. It's well written. It's also very insightful, looking at both the indigenous angle and also and the political, as well as the military participation. Now, the reason that we have these two panelists, Dr. Harry Swain and General Kent Foster, is because of the positions that they held during the Oka crisis back in 1990. I'm not going to go through all their bio points. Hopefully you will have seen those in the initial notification I sent out to everybody. But just want to make the point that Dr. Harry Swain was a Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development during the 1990 Oka crisis, and Lieutenant General retired Kent Foster was commander of Force Mobile Command, which is, of course, the Canadian Army at the time of the crisis. So we're going to get both angles of that. Harry's going to talk for about 30 minutes on the general crisis from his viewpoint. Once he's finished, then General Foster will talk for about 15 minutes. Then I'm going to bring Harry back on just to make some quick observations to bring us up to date as to what's happened since the publication of his book in 2010. And then I will start off a question and answer period with some questions that I've drafted to allow our panelists to sort of hopefully expand on a few points that they might not have had enough time to cover in any sort of detail. Then we'll look at taking some questions from the audience. For the audience, if you wish to pose a question, you need to use the chat feature on Zoom and you type in your question. I will see it. Please make your question brief and to the point. I can't guarantee we'll get to everybody's question, as this Zoom webinar will end promptly at 2:30 p.m. There's no Q&A or coffee and cookies or anything after that. So if Harry, you're ready, could you please start?
Okay, thanks, Scott, and hello to the folks I can't see. I'm really honored to be asked to speak to you, and I'm delighted to share the floor with General Foster, who actually knows something about things military. I guess the first big point is that history always rules these things, and every file in Indian country has a 200-year-old tale on it. This one's no different, except it's 300. Before 1608, the Mohawk people were the, quote, eastern door to the Iroquois Confederacy, and they occupied lands in northeast New York, near the Finger Lakes, and stretching over into the Mohawk River Valley and maybe occasionally up into the Richelieu. They were not in what is now Canada. The reason that's worth pointing out is that there is no claim to Aboriginal title or even treaty rights that's involved with these land issues that we're going to be dealing with. There are two important backstories to this. One is about the St. Regis Reservation, which is on the south side of the St. Lawrence, just south of Akwesasne, at roughly the point where Canada, the US, and Ontario and Quebec all meet. In other words, a place that was designed by the Lord for smuggling. The story there is that at St. Regis, that was the home of the great high steel working tradition among the Mohawks. Went down and built all the tall buildings in New York before the war and so on. But remember, by the 1950s, steel frame buildings were going out of style, concrete was in, these skills were no longer needed, and a lot of young men didn't have much in the way of prospects. Many of them joined the US Marine Corps to go to Vietnam. If there was a war, they conceived of themselves as being warriors, And if they were going to do it, they were going to do it with the toughest, most macho chaps they could find. That is the Marine Corps. Well, that was fine. Off they went. Quite a number of young men. They come home in the early 70s, underemployed, but with lots of small arms training. The traditional occupation in that community, ever since about 1700, and the end of the overt war around Montreal, was smuggling. There are wonderful accounts in the British colonial records of smuggling around and through that particular point, right near where Cornwall is today. On the whole border from the St. Lawrence through the Great Lakes, that was the hot spot. By the 1980s, this traditional occupation had evolved into smuggling mostly illegal things because the ordinary trade was doing fine. The biggest was cigarettes. There was an enormous cigarette trade moving at first finished cigarettes and then finally tobacco itself north by truck from the Carolinas and up into Ontario and often onto the Iroquois reservations in Ontario and for sale beyond from there. There were guns, a lot of them passing up. There was apparently a robbery of a armory in northeastern Ohio in 1979, where a whole bunch of warriors got away with a whole bunch of AR-15s and a very large quantity of 223 zipper ammunition, which features later in the story. And there was even a few people, because this was not an entirely just commercial illegal activity. Part of it was idealistically motivated. You may recall that around that time, the United States were having a war with the Sandinistas, and in all of the trouble that was going on in Nicaragua, the people who lived along the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, the Miskito, were getting it from both sides and were suffering badly. And there was a kind of underground railway that operated at the time that moved at least a few dozen Miskito people up through the United States, smuggled into Canada, and then to Saskatchewan, where the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations made a place for them. And there's still to this day a couple of small communities in north central Saskatchewan that are predominantly originally Spanish-speaking Miskito. So an interesting set of enterprises. There were a bunch of entrepreneurs, however, older fellows at St. Regis who stayed at home, who did not go to Vietnam, and who set up another series of illegal enterprises, illegal in the States, based on gambling. This took them into conflict with the New York State Police, with the Governor Cuomo before the present Governor Cuomo. These guys, who really were pretty nasty folks, often hired warriors to protect their enterprises and their movements of cash and other things. They became involved in the transport of cigarettes across the river, to the point where they'd caused a real ruckus within the two communities, St. Regis, which benefited from gambling, Akwesasne, which really didn't favor it. And there was a bit of almost a civil war within the Mohawk communities at that time. So during that time, now we're in the late 1980s, my old department, Diane, the RCMP, the OPP, and the Canadian Armed Forces were beginning to pay attention to what was going on there. One of the problems, of course, was that the Mohawks had faster boats on the St. Lawrence than anything we had. They had, guess what, cigarette boats. And would roar through the night at 60 or 70 miles an hour with a dozen cases of cigarettes. This was ignored by political Ottawa. I mean, it really didn't surface in cabinet discussions or anything. It wasn't in the newspapers much, and so it didn't get a lot of attention. The crimes in Canada about smuggling or about guns were not crimes in the United States. So when we appealed to the US authorities to help stop this, their attitude was, boy, those aren't crimes down here. What's your problem? They're really not very helpful. That's sort of backstory number one. Increasing tensions along the border with American Mohawk warriors. Backstory number two is about Kanesatake itself, about Oka. Around 1700, with the cessation of hostilities between Mohawks, or mostly Mohawks, and French settlers around Montreal, Indians started gathering around Montreal during the wintertime. They would get some welfares, soups, and firewood, and so on. But they also got a little fire water, and the merchants and the burghers of Montreal became nervous about these folks on their door. It reminds me a bit of homelessness in Victoria, but there we are. So the upshot was that the burghers of Montreal persuaded the King of France to create a new seigneury upriver, about 30 miles up the Ottawa River, at this little place called Oka, and to get the Sulpician order of monks to look after them, their souls, their requirements for food in the winter, and so on and so forth. Bit of a story, but the Sulpicians stole the land. The land was supposed to be for the Indians. The Sulpicians arranged for it to be in their name instead, and they policed the Indians who had moved up there, mostly Mohawks, but some Nipissings and Ottawas and so on. They would be very ratty about, what trees you could cut to keep warm in the winter, and you had to go to church on Sunday and all that stuff. The Sulpicians, starting right then, started selling off land to white settlers, to French colonists, to pay for their expenses. The expenses were not inconsiderable. They had to build a fort or two, and there was, of course, the wine, which had to be imported all the way from France. By the 1930s, there wasn't much land left. The Sulpicians then said, hey, we're bankrupt. They abandoned it, and away they went. What was left was a few dozen square miles of the 265 that had been created in these land grants in the 1718 to 35 period, where it wasn't clear what ownership actually applied, because once the Sulpicians walked away from it, did the land revert to the Quebec government? Well, some people in Quebec thought so. Nobody thought it belonged to the Indians, except, of course, the Indians. The Indian Act itself, which federally offers a lot of protection for Indian lands, maybe too much, didn't apply. The grants were all from the days of when France ruled, and in order to keep things quiet in conquered Quebec, where the British Army could not afford to maintain a large garrison, a whole lot of sort of placatory enactions were made. Yes, you can worship as you want. Your old land holdings are okay. The seigneurial system can sort of continue. came to a head in 1837. You recall there was quite a revolt around that time, and the government of Lower Canada said, of course. So they passed a law in 1839 confirming the Sulpicians in their ownership of this land and saying, yes, everything that happened before the conquest is fine. In that sense, the 1839 ordinance was just a replay of part of the Quebec Act of 1774, which guaranteed that prior enactions would continue all right. So by the late 19th century, the Mohawks on their checkerboard, scattered land holdings, it's almost like somebody poured pepper over a map. They were taking this to court. They figured that they might have a chance to win there. And they had several rather inconclusive and not terribly happy things, but the federal government around 1908 thought, we really do have to get a definitive settlement on this. And so they funded both sides to appeal their case to the Privy Council in London. And the Privy Council in 1910 comes down with a decision which said, in effect, we are trapped by the enactments of 1839 and 1774. And yeah, but if governments were sensible, why they would conceive of this as a charitable trust in favor of the Indians. The problem is that a charitable trust is not a concept which existed in Quebec civil law, so it went nowhere. 3 centuries of festering of shirty relationships with authorities, but on the other hand, very close relations with the French-speaking settlers. In fact, genetically, there's not a heck of a lot of difference between people who say they're Mohawks and people who say they're Quebecois in the Oka area right now. They're certainly of different, as it were, political persuasions, but biologically, they're pretty much the same mix. So what happens? Well, starts, I guess, in the 1880s when the upland to the west of the village of Oka was cleared, was barren, was sandy, and every time there was a good big windstorm, there'd be sand that would blow into the village of Oka. The Indians were persuaded to do the right thing by their neighbors, and so up on the upland, they planted quite a large forest, the pines, and it stabilized the soil, and the sandstorms went away. Very nice. Inside the pines, they had a couple of facilities that were important to their community. One was a lacrosse field. One was the community cemetery. I think that had been there for a long time before that. Okay, so there we have it. In 1989, the town council of Oka, led by a particularly blockheaded mayor, decided that they were going to expand the town golf course, which is a little 9-holer, contiguous to the pines essentially on the east side of the pines. And they were going to expand this by cutting down 100 acres of the pines. Never mind questions of ownership and who was there and so on. They went to court to get an injunction to tell the Mohawks to go away because they or Quebec owned the land and so on. And the courts in Quebec, however reluctantly, reading the letter of the law, said, yeah, I guess they got it. But this did not sit well with the Mohawks. So over the fall of 1989, towards Christmas, Mohawk people began to move into the pines and to set up camp there and to occupy it. Meanwhile, issuing grumpy statements about the mayor of Oka. occupation was, for the most part, by the time the winter of 1990 comes along, the occupation is mostly by clan mothers and women who have this particular responsibility for land ownership in the matriarchal society of the Iroquois. The confrontation went on back and forth. It was getting a little bit dicey because in my old department, which had the best on-the-ground intelligence of anybody, we were aware that some warriors from New York, from Akwesasne, were filtering up into the area and saying, we're going to protect you. Finally, and I might say we in Diane would kind of raise the issue here with central authorities in Ottawa, but again, it got not much attention because this is pretty invisible. And then what happens? We have several events happen at once. There are a lot of warriors in the trees, along with the clan mothers. We have the climax of Meech Lake. You've all forgotten about that wonder, but it was in late June of 1990 that Meech collapsed. And the two Canadian leaders who had spent so much of their political capital getting it through, Mr. Mulrooney and Mr. Bourassa, were both shattered. I mean, it was a hell of a time. Mulrooney went up to Harrington Lake and stayed there for about 3 days and didn't say anything to anybody. But then he had to get up and go because there was a G7 meeting in Houston, and he was to be there with his friend George Bush the first. Off he went. And while he was on the plane on the way home, he was passed a message to the effect that somebody named Corporal LeMay had been shot at Oka. Now, what happened then was quite a story. The mayor of Oka got an injunction from court demanding that the Sûreté de Québec go in and clean out this rabble in the woods. And finally, the SQ agreed to do so. And on the morning of the 11th of July, when a cavalcade of police cars and paddy wagons showed up on the highway that runs through the pines, next to the pines, south of the pines. And a whole lot of them get about, I've forgotten, 100, 120 people, all dressed in RoboCop uniforms with black helmets, kind of look like Darth Vader, and armed to the teeth with, guess what, AR-15s and 223 zipper ammunition. This is dawn on the 11th of July. The leader of the group walks into the encampment, and there's a couple of the women sitting there, scared crazy with all this armed whatnot, and knowing that there were warriors behind them in the trees. And the leader of the cops says, in effect, "Take me to your leader." And the women responded wonderfully. They said, "Look, this is the dawn ceremony. We're having prayers right now. You just come back in half an hour." Actually, the guy walked off. And about 20 minutes later, feeling he was being taken for a ride, came back and said, "Take me to your leader." And then he got a lesson about, well, we don't have a leader in your sense. We are a communal organization, and we take decisions after strong consultation of the community. Finally, the guy lost patience and commanded the line of cops behind him to rush the scene. Fighting broke out. There was about 20 seconds of intense fire. And the only person that was hurt was Corporal LeMay, who's kind of in the front lines, and he turned to shout to his friends behind him, raised his left hand, and got shot in the armpit and killed him. And to this day, there is a bit of a controversy over which side shot him. My own view is that it's probably the SQ. As I say, both sides were using the same ammunition. Anyhow, that got national headlines. And so what did Ottawa do? Well, the Privy Council office set up a committee, as one must. The committee met every morning at 8 o'clock under the chairmanship of the clerk of the Privy Council, and tried to manage the affair one way or another. The SQ, for their part, retreated and said, "Oh my goodness, they outgun us. We're scared of them. They've got machine guns. They've got all kinds of things in there, and we aren't going to do it." That left Bourassa with a terrible choice, because remember, simultaneously, the warriors at Kahnawake had seized the Mohawk Bridge, so that commuting for a couple 100,000 Montrealers got stopped. Once the balloon went up, all kinds of warriors began filtering into the territory to both Kahnawake and Kanesatake, and began to push aside the moderate leaders, the moderate voices on the Mohawk side. And in Chateauguay, in Montreal, one particular talk show radio went bananas with the most incendiary, vile admonitions that you can imagine, and everybody got pretty excited. So meanwhile, the PCO, under the clerk, with the deputy ministers of justice and Diane, the chief of the defense staff, would meet early morning every day. PM was closely engaged and was talking frequently to Bourassa. And I might say that I sure hope we never have another confrontation like this again, because to be able to count on the close personal friendship of those two guys who had their political losses in the 1970s, used to meet in the Ritz-Carlton in the late 70s and drink a lot of scotch, and had been resurrected and come to power again. If those two fellows had not been able to talk to each other, things would have been an awful lot worse. Bourassa in particular, I think, had some real difficulties because most of his cabinet were pretty fiercely upset by the Mohawks and by their constituents who could no longer get to work on the Mercier Bridge, and they were demanding decisive action. And if you won't call in the SQ, then who are you going to call? Well, Quebec was really kind of stuck on that. The SQ wouldn't play, and for political reasons, calling in the Gendarmerie Royale did not recommend itself. And so they found this wonderful chapter in the National Defense Act, Chapter 10, a kind of colonial hangover. The way in which the initial negotiators for Confederation stopped every province from having its own independent militia. It was that, well, if you get an insurrection or something, you may requisition the use of the Canadian Armed Forces. All you have to do, your Attorney General's just got to send a note to Ottawa, and whereupon, without a by your leave or anything from Ottawa, the chief of the defense staff was the person, the sole person in law who could respond. And the CDS would decide whether to go big or go home, how to respond, in what fashion, and so on and so forth. I think Kent may have something to say about that. Meanwhile, while this is going on, all kinds of fruitless negotiations begin. Various people thrust themselves in front of the cameras, and a funny thing begins to happen. The Mohawk demands escalate rather than converge. So we had crazy people like this lawyer Stanley Cohen from New York, or Reverend Jesse Jackson, but also some useful people. There was a tall tan lady named Jenny Jack, who's one of many Indian people from around the country who wound up in the treatment center at Oka. There was a media circus. And there were all kinds of funny things going on elsewhere. We were getting it all over the world. In Geneva, where we had just sent Jerry Shannon, our most senior finance guy, who was to negotiate the terms for the WTO. Jerry knew an awful lot about trade and finance, but zip about Indians. And Ottawa, being cheap, said, look, Jerry, you know, yes, there's various other UN committees and so on there. You're now ambassador to them too. So he found himself ambassador to the Human Rights Commission, co-chaired by a Cuban and an East German, who just had a lot of fun beating him up every morning. So Jerry would phone, usually me, and usually about 1 or 2 in the morning, saying, what have you done today? What am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to do? Anyway, it was quite a mess. But at this point, the army was requisitioned, and suddenly a dismayed prime minister found himself wondering what the CDS was going to do and how he was going to avoid going down in history as the butcher of Oka. Kent, over to you.
Thanks, Harry. Kent, you're up.
Okay, Harry, that's a great trip back. Thanks. What I'm going to try and do in 15 minutes is give you what I would call a behind-the-scenes look as commander. Give you some comments on my thoughts and challenges over the period. I'm assuming that you do have a familiarity with military organizations, terms, equipment, weapons of the day, that sort of thing. I do recognize that some of you were involved in Operation Salon, which was the Army name for the Oka crisis. I'm going to run through a quick chronology of the crisis, just to give us a time frame and something for you as a reference. I'll run from 6 August to 30 October. 6 August, the formal request for armed assistance was submitted by Barasa. It actually came to Vice Chief Defense Staff Chuck Thomas, and I'll mention that as we go. 14-15 August, I ordered 5e Brigade, 5 Brigade to deploy. On the 20th of August, we had occupied the positions in Oka. On the 23rd of August, the military had cleared the roadblock in Oka, the famous one that was seen on TV. On the 27th of August, the government level negotiations that Harry referred to, continuous negotiations, failed. Orders were given to dismantle the barricades. On the 29th of August, we reached an agreement with the warriors to open the Mercier Bridge. On the 1st of September, the military was in control of Oka, less 1 barricade, where the warriors remained on the outskirts of the pines. On the 2nd of September, in Oka, the last barricade was dismantled, and the perimeter around the treatment center was established. On the 6th of September, the Mercier Bridge opened to traffic. I remember the mathematics was something like 10 days after we had occupied our positions. Also on the 6th of September, we made an offer of military custody to those that were still behind the wire and within the perimeter of the treatment center. On the 13th of September, all communication means with the treatment center were cut, except for a single hotline. On the 26th of September, the warriors surrendered and were taken to the military custody area, which I'll talk about in a minute. 1st of October to 15 October, we had a transition plan to return control to the police forces and a phased troop withdrawal. 15 to 30 October, we put in place a quick reaction force in case things flared up. I want to follow up on Harry's description of the warriors because the term warrior was used widely and wrongly to mean any native with a gun. Warriors are members of a society, a very specific organization, the Mohawk Sovereign Security Force. It claims as its mandate the protection of the sovereignty of the Mohawk nations. Their credo is the Louis Hall Manifesto, which advocates punishing those of European descent, by the way, who oppose them. They're a paramilitary force with paramilitary objectives. The warriors, as Harry indicated, are credited by many as having de facto control over both reserves, and I tend to share that view. Among those warriors were a half a dozen or so ex-Canadian Forces members, some 15 to 20 warriors who had seen combat in Vietnam, and some had participated in training in marksmanship and weapons handling at a training site in Upper New York. My assessment was that some of the radical hardcore members were prepared to oppose any military action, i.e. there would be a potential firefight. And that potential for a firefight existed throughout the crisis. So in the situation, prior to the request for armed assistance on the 6th of November, or 6th September, the negotiations over the extension of the golf course, which had gone on for over a year, failed. In March, the Mohawks erected their first barricade to protect the pines. As Harry said, the mayor of Oka got an injunction to have it removed, and the natives refused. The SQ assault failed on 11 July, and Corporal Jacques Lemay was killed. Just to step back for an instant, the initial request from the Quebec government was made for assistance. Vice Chief Defense Staff Chuck Thomas responded and directed the technical assistance to be provided. And there was in it some protection for the police, some medical evacuation assistance, cross-country movement support, radio communications, special equipment, some C7 rifles, flak vests, night observation devices, etc. I tasked 5e Brigade to provide, and elements of the brigade with armored vehicles deployed to Montreal that same night. Aid to civil authorities, which is what the operation was exercised under, is based on regional command authority. And I was the commander, Eastern Region. I reported directly to the CDS, and it was this, I have to say, it was a decided advantage to also be commander in the Army. It was clear to me at the outset that if the Army failed to accomplish the mission and put a peaceful end to the situation, the Army would wear it forever. The stigma or stench of a botched operation with a number of dead First Nations people that led to further casualties even on the Army side would be permanent. The negativity would be permanent. The Army would live with it as part of its history, in my view, and it was just as significant as the legacy of the Louis Riel Rebellion. I was convinced that we would run this risk from day one. Interesting, the social issues raised of having armed warriors denying Canadians of their rights was less commented on than the economics of preventing tens of thousands of citizens from getting to work and being threatened by armed dissidents. There was outrage and backlash that provided backdrop to our intervention. The government mediators tried and failed in a somewhat spectacular fashion. sitting at negotiating tables with armed warriors, masked with legitimate elected authorities, and done on national TV. It was at this point that I decided I would do everything I could do to prevent anyone else from dying in Oka. The response to Premier Barras's request for armed assistance was, as Harry pointed out, the sole responsibility of the CDS. In fact, it was the Vice CDS who had received the Premier's request. And I recall Chuck Thomas and I having a discussion. He agreed I would recall 5 Brigade from leave, and he tasked me with providing my plan to the CDS before I took any actions. There were multi-sidebars taking place, of course. The PM talking with the Premier, Clerk of the Privy Council and his committee, my discussions with the CDS, my discussions with my own staff and Commander 5 Brigade, the NDHQ staff discussions with the CDS. Intelligence collection had already started, and I had some done in the operational area by Commander 5 Brigade and officers in civilian clothes. You might have a question about that. It raised some eyebrows. We began the process of educating ourselves on the Mohawk Nation and the Warrior Society. But I would suggest that the key event was a meeting in Ottawa. The CDS and I, together with Bruce Johnson from DCDS Ops, and Gord Ray, who was Chief of Land Doctrine Operations, with Premier Barras's request in hand, composed a response based on a letter to him, asking him if what the CDS was proposing was what he wanted us to do. It ended up with the tasking, and the tasking to me as Regional Commander, Eastern Region, was remove all barricades in the affected areas, restore freedom of movement on all roads and bridges, remove all strong points, and restore normal conditions of public law and order. My staff were in full mode operation and have been putting together the military appreciation, or in today's terms, estimate, and our plan. I presented the plan to DMC on the 10th of August, 1990, and basically it was in 3 phases. Phase 1, interpose the brigade between the Mohawks and the SQ. Phase 2, demand that the Mohawks remove their barricades. And Phase 3, intervene with force as a last resort and remove the barricades and eliminate their strong points. I ordered 5 Brigade to deploy to the Montreal area the night of 14-15 August. Now, over the period of time, I embraced certain principles, and I guess they became a basis of a strategy. First of all, I wanted an overwhelming show of force. I wanted our strength to be self-evident, and I counted on heavy intimidation with respect to the warriors. This, of course, was to be balanced against minimum use of force. I also determined that I would stay within the legal limits, which meant I had to seek court approval for activities like wiretapping, search and seize operation, and jamming of communications. It was clear that a firefight was possible at any stage, as I mentioned, either by the Mohawk or by accident on either side. It was one of the key factors in making sure that our intentions as a force were public knowledge. I wanted full public disclosure. Well, there is a negative to that. The disadvantage of the Mohawks knowing of our planned actions was more than offset by the fact that they would not be surprised, and convincing them that I would do what we said I would do. This clearly meant with or without their cooperation. Informing the public became a hallmark of the operation, and in my view, it served us well. We would not open fire unless fired upon. It meant we would likely take the first casualty. This was, in my view, mitigated in some part by my belief that the military word was trusted, unlike the word of the SQ. Our actions must support that trust. It also was my intention to negotiate at any time. And lastly, that time was not a factor. We would stay as long as it took, and the winter was coming. The mission highlights, I'll cover a few anecdotally. Paul Tellier, who was the clerk of the Privy Council, was instrumental in calling for a meeting of the two governments at his level. The Quebec group were the most hawkish of the two at this point. The CDS and I sat between the two principals, and their respective staffs completed a rectangle of tables. The show was clearly mine, and my staff gave a briefing that educated the group in how the military was going to work in these situations. They were taken through a best case to worst case scenario, and with the consequences of each as we escalated to a worst case of a battalion attack on Mercier Bridge. We laid out the necessary evacuation of some 300,000 residents to ensure that their safety based on the weapons templates for the kind of weapons that could be involved, and to minimize collateral damage. The plan was indeed accepted by both levels of governments. So FNC headquarters became Operation Salon headquarters. I instituted daily operations briefing every morning, including Army Ops Salon staff, liaison staff of SQ, RCMP, CSIS, CSC, SIU, and DG Info staff. Others were called as needed. A 24-hour hotline was established and in operation throughout the crisis. It became the only channel of communication once the treatment center was isolated. We also created a fully operational Joint Intelligence Center based on number 2 Electronic Warfare Squadron, SIU, the RCMP Westcam surveillance camera system, and 1 in-company of 1st Canadian Divisions. Throughout this whole time, and throughout the crisis to its end, negotiations to end the standoff were continuous. Many attempts were made to bring them out of the enclave at the treatment center, but all failed by their rejection at the last minute. So in fact, what we did is we followed the estimate/appreciation process and backed it up with the best intelligence possible from all sources, and then with our collective experience determined the best course of action. I believe it was Field Marshal Montgomery that said something like, do your appreciation, write your plan, issue your orders, and then go to bed. I changed that, humbly submitting, don't go to bed, watch TV, and watch your execution executed live. The debacle of the coming out was not anticipated. And up to the last minute, all transport and all arrangements were in place for an unobserved move of the warriors and folks behind in the treatment center to Camp Farnham was in place. However, some of the warriors they knew they had eventually to deal with the SQ, had their thing, and they made a run for it. Our barbed wire barrier was not good enough to contain them, and it did not withstand the initiative of the warriors going down to defeat in their own eyes. So a lot has been written, a lot has been said. My money for the best of them is on Harry's book. In my view, reviewing them and having read many of the books and comments and the odd video and movie, I would stay the same course. The soldiers' performance met all expectations, and the soldiers of the Canadian Army met the mission. That's it, Scott. I don't know if that was 15 minutes. Must have been close.
You were very close. I think you were 16 minutes. We're now going to pose a couple of questions that I've drafted just so that our panelists can expand on a few things. And the first question is to you, Harry. It's your book, Oka, Political Crisis and Its Legacy, came out in 2010. So that's 20 years after the Oka crisis itself. What motivated you to write that book at that particular time?
Well, several things, one of which is that secret documents and cabinet materials and so on became available at that point. I mean, I knew of them, and I may even have had one or two copies around, but one could not disclose them publicly at that point. But there was also the other thing that is, after 1990, I still had to earn a living, and writing a book doesn't go easily with being a deputy minister. I had to wait till I retired.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned the National Defense Act, that if a provincial government made a request for military assistance, it would go straight to the CDS, and it would be the CDS who decided on the nature and the level of the response. So am I right in understanding that completely left out of that process is Parliament and the federal government? Is that correct? That to Harry?
Yes, it is.
And is that still the case?
Yes, because Parliament has not seen fit to dabble in that particular bundle of historical confusions. There was some study after the fact about whether that chapter of the National Defense Act needed modernization, but aside from some background and staff work, nothing was ever done.
Kent, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, Scott. There were, over the length of time I spent in uniform, occasions where, not quite as dramatic as this, but where the National Defense Act was looked upon as Harry described it, needing modification. I recall in virtually every instance, no one wanted to open the National Defense Act for a specific reason, in that once they opened it, everything was on the table. And that was often trotted out as one more reason not to go there.
That, by the way, is the kind of excuse that politicians use for inaction. It isn't true, but it's a good excuse.
Was there not something else we could have used in lieu of the National Defense Act to achieve the same effect, Harry? What about the War Measures Act or the Emergency Act? Does any of those things, would they have fit better or worse? Or
they weren't a very good fit. They tend to apply only to the actions of the federal government. Here, the if you will, the offended government was really that of Quebec, and it was an insurrection that happened on their turf, on their territory, all the way, and they would have insisted on being in charge. So, in that sense, it was the National Defense Act was a better piece for them, and the choice lay with them. That is, nobody could stop them from making the necessary requisition. And once that was in play, everything else would fall aside.
Okay, the next question I have for both of you, and I'll start with Kent, is in the allocation of using 5 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, which of course includes mechanized infantry battalions, as well as artillery and eventually a few tanks, was that the right allocation or balance of forces? And when Kent finishes, Harry, maybe you can make some observations about were there any other paramilitary or police forces we could have used instead of the military? But I'll start with you, Kent.
Okay. This assessment of what resources to apply to these kind of hot situations always require a review of what you want to use. My experience over my career was that first rule, make sure that you identify everything that you think you're going to need to resolve or to meet the mission. And I learned this as the commander of the 8th Mobile Force Battalion when I deployed to North Norway. I learned it again at providing troops to the 1976 Olympics, and I learned it again for OCA. In the meeting I described with the CDS&I and DCDS and CLDO, we very clearly laid out what was required. And also for the tactical commander, I laid out exactly what equipment and weapons and ammunition should be used. And for example, white phosphorus as a smoke deterrent was clearly identified as not to be used. But I used mortar, or I included mortar, because I wanted mortar illumination and I wanted the ability to use mortar for smoke in terms of covering movement of troops and activities. Automatic weapons goes without saying, because when you look at the kinds of weapons caches up to automatic rifles, etc., also a 50 caliber machine gun on the other side, it meant that I wanted my full slate of weapons. And there's a principle at play here too. Armies based on infantry battalions and brigades function at their very best and deliver what you want in the most effective way by working within the structure that they train with. And when you start taking chunks out of it and trying to replace it with other things, you destroy a certain harmony that might be vital to success of the operation. Artillery was not used and tanks were not used. So it's a minor correction there, but mortars were definitely deployed, and tank dozers, specifically identified as tank dozers, were identified. And I wanted them in case I had to physically dismantle barriers, which in some cases were quite considerable, like 40 passenger buses cemented into the ground, etc. And of course, the most obvious reason for going with 5 Brigade, you were in French Canada. You had to be able to deal with French Canada and the warriors and OCA in their own language and on their own terms. So quite frankly, 5 Brigade was in exactly the right place to do this. So I had no qualms at all about having 5 Brigade.
Harry, did you have any thoughts on that?
I remember thinking during the affair of the general from Alberta addressing the Quebec cabinet in French. And that must have been one of the more interesting elements of that month.
Can I add a comment there? Harry, one of the things ever present on my mind was that if an Anglophone commander of the army could not perform in OCA, the chances of an Anglophone general being a commander of the army, again, was in severe jeopardy.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't have any comments on the adequacy of force or the particular choices that General Foster made, except that the decision to have an overwhelming show of force was in prospect and retrospect absolutely the correct thing to do. it just made all of the crazies say, I'd rather live next week than not. I think early on, General Foster and General de Chastelain made some critical decisions on rules of engagement, on that business of the show of force, which guided them through. And there's a nice apocryphal tale about the two of them sitting, I think, in John's office and deciding that there wasn't anything in this goddamn golf course that was worth another life. I think it does them credit. My last comment about the military as such is that the discipline of the Army, of the 5e Brigade, was amazing, in spite of all kinds of rattling tactics and insults and whatnot on the part of the MSSF and others. They stood their ground. They refused to get angry and get mad, whatever. I think the control exercise by the field officers was marvelous. And I think that the troops showed an enormous amount of discipline. You really did as well. We would, as you say, have suffered a permanent loss of global reputation had anything gone wrong. And I think the set of tactics that you chose were the best possible under the circumstances.
Got a question here from one of our audience members, and from Leonard Jenks. Do we have, and of course it's been 30 years now, but do we have any estimate of the number of weapons, legal or otherwise, that were seized at Oka? You mentioned a couple, Kent. Do we have any other sort of more accurate numbers by types and whatnot?
Well, I can, let me run down what was confirmed on site.
Okay.
The numbers I'll speak to in a minute, but a 50 caliber Barrett long range sniping rifle. And all of us are now familiar with Canadians being the world's finest snipers. But having a sniping rifle on the other end while you're standing up on a stump in Oka with the thought of a sniping rifle being out there is interesting. There was the FN rifle, an RPK-74 light assault rifle, AK-47s in some numbers, AR-15s in some numbers, USI submachine gun, Ruger Mini 14 rifle, grenades, assortment of shotguns, pistols, hunting rifles, dynamite, and Molotov cocktails. There were some unconfirmed ones, and they were M60 GPMG, or the general purpose machine gun, some bazookas, M72 anti-tank weapons, unconfirmed, and rumored that mines and mortar, certainly booby traps and explosives. I can, in terms of numbers, when we finally occupied the territory of the treatment center, it was awash in burned weapons. Dozens and dozens of weapons that were thrown into the bonfire. On one particular search and seizure operation, and we put this, by the way, on TV, and it was part of our public information program. We uncovered 47 rifles, pistols, including most of the rifles that I mentioned. There was plenty of armor out there, or plenty of weaponry, to create any number of serious problems.
Okay,
I don't know if that's a really great answer. You'd have to dig into some of the writings to actually produce numbers, but all the warriors were armed.
Okay, thanks. Got a question from Mac Evans. His question is to both Kent and Harry, and he also says, great presentation, thanks for your insights. Were either of you asked to provide advice during the transportation blockades? And I assume he's looking at the Wet'suwet'en blockades this past winter. Were either of you asked for advice?
No, for me.
Okay.
I have only been asked for advice on dealing with First Nations in protest mode once since I retired, and we're talking 30 years now since this happened. And it was by the current CDS at the time, Moberee.
Okay, question from the audience for Harry. It's from Craig Cotter. The book, or the title of the book, speaks of legacies, and then of course it's a political crisis and its legacy. Can you elaborate on what you mean by legacy?
Thanks for that. Oddly enough, the title was chosen by the publisher, not the author. But I did think about some of the things that have happened since. If you think about the shifts in federal government policy since 1990, let's say, since the affair, there's quite a number. First, I think, would be the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which is a very large affair. Not entirely uncontentious, but with a lot of good scholarship behind it, and which is being mined to this day for good ideas and for historical insight. In the middle 90s, the federal government began to accept the so-called inherent right of self-government as flowing from Section 35 of the Charter, and said so publicly and began to shift their negotiating stance on treaties and so on. In 97, we had the Delgamuukw case. All of the leading cases, I might say, in Indian affairs do seem to come from British Columbia. But Delgamuukw, as many of you will know, was the one that firmly established that Aboriginal title did exist. And it established that Indian oral history could be accepted as any other kind of evidence, subject to challenge and so on and so forth, in a court of law. Negotiations during the 90s and aughties were desultory, and the change in basic appreciations hadn't really occurred very much. I think it has now. Stimulated in part by the Chilcotin decision of 2014, which was the one that said Aboriginal title exists not only in theory, but in fact on this 1,700 odd square kilometers of British Columbia. And it laid out in considerable detail what that meant in a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court, written personally by the Chief Justice. Whoa, can't get any heavier stuff than that. Following that, we have the acceptance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the federal government and now by the British Columbia government. They both legislated their acceptance of those principles. We had, in the first recent Liberal government under Jody Wilson-Raybould, the development in detail of legislation giving life and tooth to these ideas and to those in Section 35. What does recognition mean? What kind of land rights are we talking about? Who is bringing what to the table, and so on. That bill never saw the light of day. It disappeared with Jody Wilson-Raybould. Carolyn Bennett has been following it up, and you can see some echoes of that in the agreements that they made with the Wet'suwet'en on the blockade up here. So I guess it's fair to say that the results of all this was a continuing skepticism on the part of Native peoples about colonialism and about armies and so on and so forth. A skepticism that was, in the case of the Army, allayed somewhat by that very interesting gesture at the end of the Mercier Bridge occupation, when the Army, I think the day after everybody went home, found itself in the possession of one of those Mohawk flags, you know, the red flag with Guyana, and went through a process of folding it up in that triangular way that armies have, and giving it back to the Mohawk warriors. That was noted, and it's still talked about. Still an oral culture in lots of ways. Other than that, though, the immediate land issues at Kanesatake were kind of semi-resolved a little bit, but the larger issues of the 265 square miles of the old seigneury still undealt with. And the community remains divided against itself and unable to articulate any kind of durable view of things, despite some occasionally quite good leadership. So that would be that story, I think.
Kent, did you have any comments you wanted to make on this idea of legacies from Oka?
You asking me or Harry?
Yeah, if in reference to the question from the audience about Oka and its legacies, I realize you didn't come up with that title. You're not the author of the book, but did you have any thoughts of legacies from the Army's point of view?
Yeah, well, from the military point of view, the recognition must be that there was an out of control situation. The military were the last resort to return law and order and regulate the situation. The real disappointment in it was that one of my aims was to provide an atmosphere and climate and condition that governments could address the issues of Oka. I am not up to speed on what's going on in the area to any degree now, but if you could subtract the gun running and the cigarette smuggling and the liquor smuggling, etc., and actually concentrate on what Harry started this process with, an assessment of the promises made over land and land ownership. The disappointment, it's not being addressed. It's still out there. Mm-hmm. If I look at the strictly land issues and ownership and the care of the land. You're talking about protesting the gas and oil industry and pipelines, etc. So I think in Harry's words, this is not an Oka situation. My only, my comment on that would be, but it certainly could become one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, for both Harry and Kent, we'll start with Harry. The next question is, did the use of armed and masked warriors wearing uniforms, etc., and carrying weapons help or hinder the Mohawk cause, specifically through their public confrontations with the Army as exemplified by that photograph stare down between the warrior Lasagna and a Canadian Army corporal? Harry.
The Canadian Army corporal was Master Corporal Patrick Kluche. I don't know if you want to go first, Harry, go ahead.
Well, just to say that the consensus of the communications pros, and I must say I was too close to this to have a reliable independent view, but the conclusion was that the Mohawks did themselves a huge amount of damage in the public eye by appearing as a really serious armed force and so on. That went down awfully badly.
Kent.
Yeah, the return we were getting throughout the 70 to 80 to 90 days was they were losing. They did not have public support on the Mercier Bridge issues and the barricades, etc. but the warriors massed lost the support for the Mohawk cause. And it gradually fell away over the period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, Kent, the Army likes to put everything into nice, convenient boxes in the view of terminology and whatnot. And of course, a term that probably wouldn't have been used too much back in 1990, but is used widely now, is the term counterinsurgency. And of course, we've referred to the warriors and the Oka crisis and whatnot as being an insurrection. Is there value in describing the Oka crisis as basically a counterinsurgency?
Well, I don't want to turn into a military scholar or anything, but to me, it would mean you're trying to overthrow the government in a fundamental, the fundamental aspect of insurgency operations is to defeat the serving government. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. My view would be I would lean towards it being an insurrection because of, quote, a limited objective of not trying to overthrow the Prime Minister and his government.
Well, a footnote to that, the Iroquois Confederacy, the old traditional government, the Haudenosaunee, regards the governments of Canada and the United States as illegal, Johnny-come-lately invaders of their territory. They have never been conquered, and they've never ceded the land, and they're still in charge. Well, it's a view, but it's strongly held in some quarters.
And defended.
Yeah, and the MSSF that you so rightly mentioned is founded on that notion.
What, that they've never been defeated?
Yeah, that they're the legitimate governments of, that part of North America that's kind of within 500 miles of the Finger Lakes.
But you did mention in your book that technically they have been defeated because they surrendered at the treatment center, and of course they burned their weapons.
I think that, yeah, that's true, but I don't think that they believe that.
And we may be splitting hairs between tactics and strategy, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to use the term because it's so well known and it doesn't add value. And of course, a definition goes with it. And as you've sort of indicated, Kent, the definition may not necessarily fit that well, and it may lead you down somewhere else. So, Harry, we touched on this, but there have been recent newspaper stories came out, I think, in the summer, maybe July and August, about a dispute between one of the leaders of the Mohawk community in Kanesatake and the Oka mayor, not the same one from 1990, but it indicated that Indigenous grievances and also tensions between those two communities still exist and are still ongoing. And if the 1990 crisis was not necessarily resolved, at least from the Mohawk viewpoint, again, this is a maybe splitting hairs, but can we actually say that one party to this crisis won, even though we might not necessarily be able to say another one was defeated? Can we use that term? That's for Harry.
No, I think both of them won in the sense that things are peaceful there and the hostilities are limited to insults. And even then they tend to be walked back if made in a moment of heat. Both the current mayor and the current chief at Kanesatake have said things in public and got a lot of pushback and have, moderated their stance. They've been doing things like they'll have, at least before the COVID affair came along, they were having occasional dinner meetings And there's nothing like a shared meal and some informal conversation to help you understand the other guy. So those kinds of things were not anywhere on the agenda in 1989, 90. So in that sense, things are probably a little better.
Okay, I'll pose a question to you, Kent, and then I'll go to Harry. Do you have any last thoughts about the Oka crisis, or anything maybe you would have liked to have touched on, but we haven't been able to touch on in this relatively short session, considering the topic? Kent, do you have any last thoughts?
Well, I mean, it was a national story in its day. It in fact proved successful from the point of view of government of the day being able to deal with that kind of an insurrection. I mean, I look at it as commander of the army at the time, as that we successfully met the mission. But I also harbor, and have since those years gone by, at how sad it is to see these various conditions involving First Nations people in terms of being moved from pillar to post, housing that is promised and not delivered, substandard living conditions, even though significant amounts of money, government money, taxpayers' money, is being contributed to improve those things. The results that have been obtained are, I mean, they're incredible.
Harry,
Yeah.
any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with Kent on that. On the other hand, glass half full, there's a whole lot of green shoots appearing these days. There is a national consciousness of the unfairness of the results of the colonial enterprise. Quite a broad sense that we need to do something about it. Magnified or echoed in part by what's happening in the United States with Black Lives Matter and so on. This does seem to be maybe the decade of human rights in that sense. I think the government's slow evolution of its view on the meaning of Section 35 of the Charter, and therefore the duties of government, to make room, for example, for self-government for Indian groups, just as one example, is helpful and is a big difference between now and a generation ago. I hope so.
Time will tell. Okay, we're going to wrap it up now. I want to thank both our guest panelists, Lieutenant General retired Kent Foster, former commander of the Canadian Army, and also Dr. Harry Swain, former Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, who's also a professor up at UVic in the Global Affairs Center. I want to thank both of you, and I want to, for an excellent presentation, very insightful. Again, it fleshes out the book even more. I recommend the book to anyone who would like to, as a neophyte like me, who knows next to nothing about Indigenous issues, can basically get into enough of the information that gives you what you need to know about that particular crisis without going too deep on some aspects. So again, congratulations to you, Harry, and thank you very much, Kent and Harry. Wait, I just want to check here. I've got something on chat. A couple of comments. We have a couple of minutes. From Chris Gaynor, I really enjoyed the presentations. From Don McNamara, superb presentation. Thanks to both very much. Paul Saguna, thanks for an informative event. Craig Cotter, great presentation, well done. Looks like that's it for now. So again, positively received. That's the aim. Everybody learns something, and maybe they'll buy the book and they'll learn a little bit more. So to both of you, Harry and Kent, have a good day. I'll be sending you something on email. I'm going to buy each of you lunch if you're interested. So that's the least I can do. So
All right.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks
And
a
have-
lot, Scott.
Okay, have a good afternoon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.